Hi, everyone. My name is Logan, and thanks for coming to my talk, Eye on the Sky, Building Investigative Journalism Tools for Analyzing Airplanes. So I work for Bellingcat, and we're a Dutch NGO that does a mixture of investigative journalism, research, and education. But we started over 10 years ago as a blog, when our founder, Elliot Higgins, realized that he could look at photos on social media and find out things about where weapons were coming from in the Syrian civil war that no one else was reporting on. And this method of looking at public information on the internet and turning it into journalism is now quite common. Every major newspaper has a division that does things like this. But at the time, it was brand new, and no one else was willing to do it. And that's developed into a field known as open source journalism, using open source research methods. Bellingcat kept applying these methods over and over, and eventually became well known for our research into Russia, especially, the downing of MH17 over eastern Ukraine, and the poisoning of the Russian opposition leader, Alexei Navalny. But our coverage now has a much more global perspective. So it's important to note that when I say open source journalism, I mean something a little bit different than open source software, which is probably what a bunch of people jump to. I mean source in a journalistic sense, like a source of information. So a lot of journalism, traditional journalism, relies on closed sources. A journalist knows someone at a politician's office or gets some piece of information from someone at a company that no one else has, and then they turn that into a story. They break news. Open source journalism, instead, uses information that is already publicly out there somewhere. It might take some digging to find it, but in theory, anyone has access to it. And that means that stories that are published with open source journalistic methods are often more verifiable because the reader can go back and look at exactly where the information came from, and they're more transparent because they can use that information to reproduce the conclusions that that article came to. You might have heard this by a lot of other terms. Open source intelligence is quite a common one, though it's one that we shy away from because there's honestly a lot of bad, quote, OSINT out there. And you've probably seen some of it if you've been on the internet or following the war in Ukraine or the war in Gaza. Online and open source investigation, open source research, these all refer to the same things, journalism using open sources. So there's a wide variety of open sources that we use. Geospatial ones are some of the most important: maps, satellite imagery, ship data, plane tracking data. User-generated media is also really important because, as any hacker knows, people are their own worst enemy, and people love to tell on themselves on the internet. So the things that people post to Facebook, to Twitter, to LinkedIn, that's really valuable. Traditional media reporting can also be important. There might be things in the background of a wire photo that no one's noticed. Public databases and records and archived materials like the Internet Archive can also be huge. And then there's gray area open sources that, depending on the context, may or may not be used. Things like leaked materials and databases, contact books that are exposed through these sketchy apps that people don't know are stealing their whole address book information, an unsecured MySQL database or an open AWS bucket, or even dark web markets can be interesting sources of data. So even though open source research and open source software have very different histories and are using the terminology a bit different, there's a shared ethos that hopefully we can all appreciate: values of transparency, of reproducibility, and this idea of collaboration, that you can put something out there and anyone else can find it and keep building on it. So I'd like to really zoom in on one of these sources here and talk about flight tracking data in particular, and some of the tools that I've been working on in the past few months to try to do more with flight tracking data. So We're all nerds. Probably a lot of you have used flight tracking websites like FlightAware to keep track of what time your flight is, or if you're really savvy, to keep track of how on time the flight before yours is and whether that's going to delay your flight. And maybe you've seen things like this, posts on Twitter, in this case a few weeks before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, that tracked a bunch of Russian military jets moving around and was a sign of things to come with the invasion. But there's lots of ways that flight tracking data can be used in journalism. Here's some recent examples from some of my colleagues at Bellingcat. My coworker Peter wrote this article recently looking at the vice president of Equatorial Guinea, who had been vacationing in Sardinia on what was claimed to be a military vessel, but was actually a luxury yacht, on taxpayer dime, of course, in a very poor country. And the way that he proved that it was actually the vice president who was out here in Sardinia was combining flight tracking data with Instagram posts to show that he was really in Sardinia. This was some really interesting research from last year, where a colleague investigated the Kinahan cartel and its kingpin, Kinahan Sr., who, despite having a $15 million bounty on his head, could not stop himself from posting lots of Google reviews of every restaurant he ate at all around the world. And they were able to track him down through these Google reviews, find one where there was a mirror in the background that actually revealed it was him taking the photos and everything, and then take that further, finding an associate of his by following an aircraft that was involved in a drug investigation and combining it with social media posts and info about where this man was. Another colleague of mine has worked extensively in analyzing what's happening in Venezuela. And one of the most important ways that you can get information out of Venezuela is through open source methods, because it's very restrictive for journalists. And he's looked at flight tracking data to follow where the government is going and meeting with people, what oligarchs are getting involved in new projects in Venezuela, and how the US is involved through these downed narco planes over the last few years. Of course, it's not just Bellingcat doing this work, nor is it just journalists at big major newspapers. I think one of the most important projects out there right now is what this guy, Tom Cartwright, has been doing while in his retirement with this nonprofit called Witness at the Border. He's been tracking flights for ICE, the US Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and how they're moving people around from detainee camps to foreign camps and all over, just by meticulously following each of these aircraft and knowing what kinds of contractors and planes they fly and keeping a record of it. This includes Guantanamo Bay and the mega prison in El Salvador. And he's done this for years, before Trump, actually, so that he can create a record of exactly how many flights and how many people are being moved around and how that's changing over time. And this is all through the same data that FlightAware uses. And finally, there's Jack Sweeney, who many of you have probably heard of or seen. He was a college sophomore that created this Twitter bot for tracking Elon Musk's private jet and posting information about where Elon Musk was flying to. Elon Musk famously did not like this very much, called it basically assassination coordinates, which is very funny, and threatened legal action over this. Luckily, Jack Sweeney is not so easily deterred, and the bot's now up and running on Blue Sky, and we can still track when Elon Musk takes an 18-minute flight from one side of Los Angeles to the other side of the city. So how do these sites work? Essentially, there's two ways to get this info. There's published flight plans, which are kind of difficult for a hobbyist or the general public to get access to. And there's transponder data called ADS-B. Now, this ADS-B data is just being sent out all the time by airplanes. And it includes lots of really interesting information, like the identifier of the aircraft, where it is, how high it is, and how fast it's going. And they're unencrypted radio signals that can be received by anyone who builds a receiver. It doesn't cost very much at all. All you need is a software-defined radio, an antenna, and a Raspberry Pi, and you're basically good to go. However, each of these receivers only has a range of about 100 to 300 kilometers, so you're only going to measure the airplanes that are right around you. These global flight tracking websites use an aggregation of lots and lots of these receivers from all over the world. And they combine this with some commercial data that they have access to create the ETAs and things that you may have seen. If you run one of these receivers, you can feed your data to these websites, and usually they'll give you something in exchange for that, like a professional-grade subscription to the website or access to data. So there's lots of these sites out there. The commercial ones are maybe the ones that you're most aware of. But there's also these hobbyist ones, hobbyist and researcher. And what's really nice about a lot of these is that they don't filter out the data. A lot of the commercial sites won't show military aircraft. These ones show everything they can get. And ADSB lol is my favorite, and I'll come back to why in a second. But first, let's look at the distribution of receivers. So this is for ADSB.lol, where all of their receivers are in the world. And what stands out, right, is the obvious geographic distribution inadequacy. We don't have very many receivers in South America, in Asia, in Africa. And while the commercial sites are a little bit better, they're still not great. Now, we can get lots of data about flights that are high up, because that goes a long ways, line of sight is far. But this is a problem for trying to get information about flights landing or traveling at a lower elevation. So if you're in one of these areas that doesn't have coverage, please set up one of these receivers. But if you're in Amsterdam or somewhere that already has lots of coverage, does that mean that it's worthless to set up a receiver? No, not really, because of this technique called multilateration, where planes that are flying with older responders that don't actually send their location data, you can still measure that by looking at the time difference of arrival to multiple sensors all around it and kind of triangulating from there. You also get really cool dashboards that show you all of your data, and you can see the performance of your receiver over time. So if you want to set one of these up, I think the easiest way to do it is this GitHub package that my friend Ketil made, which lets you install the software on a Raspberry Pi that you can monitor through Balena, which is like an Internet of Things cloud management service. And you can feed it to as many of these websites as you want. There's also a fork I made that lets you track ships as well, if you're interested in that. So many flight tracking tools are great for following an interesting flight in real time or looking at the details of a specific plane's journey, but I really wanted a tool that would support some different questions. Like, what's the baseline for a certain flight pattern historically? Or what planes have been where? Not necessarily at an airport or not necessarily on a published flight plan. So the thing that's really great about ADSB-lol is they're the only one that provides access to a historical archive. All the data's there. They make these GitHub releases every day that contain about 3 gigabytes of data about all of the plane traffic on their network that day. So I downloaded about 1.5 years worth of these, and I put it into a database, because 8.6 billion rows, that's still small data, right? We can put that in Postgres, and it knows what to do. And the answer is, yeah, that mostly works. We'll come back to that. And the data is as simple as possible. We get information on the time that the plane was detected, what the plane was, its flight number that it's broadcasting out, altitude, ground speed, the location as a post-gist geometry, and the bearing, which I just calculate from all the locations. There's another useful source of data, the TAR 1090DB, that provides the registration and the type of aircraft, as well as the owner. And then there's some augmented data I added of the category of plane and whether or not it's a military aircraft. And then the tool itself is a pretty simple search interface for making queries against this data. And it's probably easiest to demonstrate by showing some examples. So here, let's look at all of the planes that are flying around Area 51. I'm going to drag a region of interest around Area 51. And because no traffic is allowed here except for military planes, that's all I need to do to hopefully find some interesting flights. And we can see trends in activity, like there's been an increase since October of 2024, and we can see the planes that are flying. Most of these have this Janet flight code, or just another non-existent terminal, the highly secretive transportation service used to move personnel to and from Area 51. We can see a map of where these are. This doesn't tell us that much in this case, but sometimes it can be informative. And we can look at information about the owner of the planes. So we can see that there's this one Beach King Air that's owned by corporate, and we can look at that in more detail. And then we can see that based on these call signs and based on its flight patterns, this isn't a corporate airplane. This is definitely a government airplane of some kind. A related question, based here in the Netherlands, what patterns of military aircraft can we see at the Volkel Air Force Base? So if we zoom in on Volkel Air Base here, do the same thing, drag a box around it, the one thing we need to be careful of is now there's other flights. So I'm going to set a maximum altitude and select only military flights so that we only get things that are landing at that airport. And now we can look at the results, and one of the trends that we see is that there was a big decrease in activity, right, around October of 2024, it looks like. It's even more clear in the monthly view. And the reason for that is that's when the Dutch Air Force phased out their F-16 training program. And by filtering to just F-16 aircraft, now we can see that very clearly. There's also filters that I added for bearing. So that's helpful if we want to see, for instance, patrols around this border, the US-Canada border. Can drag a very thin box around the border and set a bearing range of only planes that are flying roughly due east. And what that picks up is these patrol helicopters with the code C013B3 here that the Canadian government was briefly flying along the Canada border to try to appease Trump and avoid the tariffs. Some other questions that I thought were interesting. What business jets have been flying to Guantanamo Bay? So this is a similar question. We can drag a box. Now, there's no ADS-B receivers at Guantanamo Bay. It's a pretty restricted place. But we can see the approach path. We can see when planes are coming in to land. So we'll use that as a proxy, set a maximum altitude, and then we need to set our aircraft category to be only business jets. Now, when we run this query, what we see is what looks like a very consistent level of activity. But one thing that I think is kind of interesting here, well, first we can look at the planes. Unfortunately, a lot of times with aircraft, the owner doesn't give you much information because most aircraft are owned by holding companies. Oftentimes, the holding company only owns that aircraft. But what we can see if we look at this by aircraft is that actually the planes themselves are totally different after the Trump administration came into power. Same number of aircraft, but different planes. What aircraft have flown between Guantanamo and El Salvador? This could be interesting because the US was putting prisoners in Guantanamo and sending them to El Salvador. So this was really the main reason I wanted to make this tool, was I wanted to not only find planes in one region of interest, but be able to draw two regions of interests and ask what planes have been in both of these places within some time of each other. So I drag a big box here around the San Salvador airport, And then I set a limit, and I say, OK, planes that have been 1 day apart in this area, or 86,000 seconds, intuitively enough. And when we search here, we find a relatively small number of planes, but they're all kind of interesting. And one of the things that we can see is that the owner for these, a lot of them, is Global Crossing Airlines, which is one of the contractors that ICE is using to move detainees around. So those are definitely flights from Guantanamo to El Salvador that contained prisoners. Another question might be, what aircraft have been in both New York and Moscow within 24 hours? Does anyone have any guesses? Shout it out. Yeah. So we can do this. And in the interest of time, can I skip ahead? Maybe I can't skip ahead. All right, you get to watch a big box being dragged for a minute. So we'll drag a box around JFK Airport in New York. No, I can't skip ahead. All right. And dragging a box around Moscow, making sure to get all of the many airports in Moscow. Set our time difference. So flights when the same aircraft was in both places with less than a day of difference. And set a maximum altitude so we get aircraft that weren't just flying over. And when we run this, now we can see basically every time that there was a flight in both New York and in Moscow within 24 hours. And most of these are airlines like Qatar Airways or Turkish Airlines that fly to all of these places. You know, they might use the same flight between Russia and Qatar and then between Qatar and New York. But we also see these Russia State Transport Company flights. And these are official visits from Russia to the United States or moving consular staff around. And we can see when all of these movements happened by looking at this data. There's also a lot of flight enthusiasts that love to get photos of these planes. This is from JFK. And as I was putting together these examples, one question kept coming back to me. I looked through the data. Why are there so many balloons? There are so many balloons in this flight tracking data, and I don't know about you, but I rarely see a hot air balloon out there. So this is another thing that you can do, which is just an unfiltered, ungeospatially filtered query on a particular type of aircraft. So I'll plug in balloons here, run a search, and we can look at all of the balloons up to 10,000. In that case, this only gets the past couple of days. And let's zoom in on the Netherlands first. And these look like hot air balloons, I think. They're going up, and then it looks like they're all drifting with the wind, which must have been blowing to the southeast that day. But if we go over to the United States, we see all of these things that have a pretty different pattern. It's just like a single point, and everything stacked on that point. And there's a few of these all along the border. And if we look at the details about these aircraft, what we can see is that they're these tethered aerostats run by Customs and Border Protection, or in reality, the private contractor Peraton. And these are really weird aircraft. They're hovering above the border, above these towns, 24/7, recording all of this surveillance information. They're tethered, they're on a line to a fixed base station. And a lot of people in these towns, both in the United States and Mexico, really resent having this surveillance balloon over their house all the time. I wanted to show two other really cool tools besides mine before I wrap up. One is ADS-B Exposed, which is run as a demo by ClickHouse, the database. And it's a visualization of millions of aircraft simultaneously. Here you can see the altitude and velocity of every plane in the database, really highlighting airports and where they land. Here's another visualization I like, looking at when planes are traveling very steeply up or down. And this really highlights the jet training facilities around military bases. You can see all the places they practice. John Weissman makes tons of great tools with ADS-B data. GPS Jam is one of the most interesting. It uses this flight data to show where there's GPS interference, which has been a big problem, especially in the Baltics in the past few years. There's lots of ways to go further on flight tracking if you're interested, and lots of things I didn't have the time to get into. You can look at the different types of ways of identifying an aircraft, even if it changes hands. You can look at plane spotting websites where enthusiasts photograph them. But I'd recommend getting started by checking out our beginner's guide to aircraft tracking if you're interested in this. And there's also lots of future work that I'd like to do on this tool to make it more useful and interesting. Finding planes that travel together could be really interesting, I think. Improving the geofencing and some UI conveniences. Lots of little changes I'd like to make to this tool. Performance could be better. And Bellingcat is a nonprofit organization that depends on people and supporters and readers in our community to continue existing. And this is where a traditional nonprofit might say, hey, please donate, give us money. I'm instead going to ask for pull requests. So if this is interesting to you, if this is the kind of thing that you'd like to work on, check out our GitHub. There's not just this project, but many others out there that you can contribute to and find issues to work on. And feel free to reach out to me over email, Blue Sky, or on Fedi, or find me afterwards. I'll stick around for a few minutes and ask any questions you might have. Thanks for coming.